Right, thank you very much, Brooks. Well, the slides come up, hopefully. I'm going to have a lot of slides, so I'm going to rush through at vast speed, and you won't have time to process most of the information that's on the slides in order to win the X Prize that I would very much like to partake in. The slides come. It's going to be even harder to win if the slides don't come up. Poor old Morgan back there is having a difficult time today. So what I'm talking about is how we measure our progress and how basically we're moving beyond GDP, and we all accept GDP doesn't really, and profit alone don't really tell us a very good story about whether we're heading in the right direction as a society or not. And I want to talk briefly about an initiative I've been involved in for the last 7 or 8 years to try and create a coherent framework for measuring how our society is progressing. I should say at the start, this has nothing to do with my work at The Economist. This is something that came out of a Global Agenda Council of the World Economic Forum that I chaired that involved philanthropists, social activists, innovators, academics, where we were all tasked with coming up with something useful to say that was a global innovation that was helpful to social innovation. And it became clear from the conversations we all had that there was really no common framework for comparing social innovations in one place with social innovations in another place and figuring out what was working and what wasn't. And this is really an attempt to try and do something about that. So you'll know about the commission chaired by Stiglitz and Sen and others to after the financial crash to basically talk about how there is a direct connection between measuring the wrong things and having bad outcomes. And this has really catalyzed the whole move away, I think, from the 20th century model where we really focused on measuring the financial performance of the economy and society. Enormous amount of effort went on from really the late 20s and the crash then through to the 50s in defining GDP and defining profit for corporations. I think the 21st century model, we started to see a lot of challenge to that. We saw the UN developed its Human Development Index. This turns out to have been a big step forward, but unfortunately is so highly correlated with GDP, particularly once you move out of the low-income country area, that it really stopped having a lot of use to places like this. We had a growing interest in what was going on with Bhutan with the Global Happiness Index, but again, feeling that that's probably a bit too subjective to be really useful for people on the ground. And then we've also, with the Sustainable Development Goals, now got Jeff Sachs producing an SDG index, which I think is interesting but flawed because the SDGs are quite flawed in terms of mixing outcomes together with inputs and processes and so forth. So it's quite hard to really measure them in a systematic and objective way. We launched the Social Progress Index, which involved funding from people like Ford, Rockefeller, Skoll, Larry Page and others, and brought in Michael Porter and Scott Stern in Cambridge to provide some academic rigor to what we were doing. It is really exclusively social and environmental indicators. All of them are outcomes, so there's no financial data in there. It's all physical measures. We've initially, in launching it for countries, made it relevant to all the countries in the index, and we really had a focus on actionability. I think the key for an index to be adopted like this is that it's actually useful for people on the ground making decisions about where they need to prioritize in policy in terms of driving a better society. As I say, a lot of data. There are 12 components of this index and 52 data sets that are being used. The three main pillars of which the 12 components are organized into are basic needs, what we call the foundations of well-being, and opportunity. We've found that as we've gone around sharing this information, that it's widely resonates with people. People feel we've covered with those 12 boxes pretty much the range of issues that people care about when they think about what a good society, well-functioning society looks like. Anything like this is going to be somewhat arbitrary, but we feel we've got a lot of resonance with this as we go around with it. We just released the latest results. So if you score it out of 100, social progress, with the 45 being fairly bad, The lowest on the score, lowest scores being places like Afghanistan and Central African Republic are in the late high 20s, early 30s. Some of the best performing countries are in the high 80s. The world as a whole has gone from 63.19 to 64.85 in the last since in the 5 years we've been doing this, which is progress, but modest progress compared to what GDP has been doing, and tells us quite a lot of things. You can see here on each of those issues where progress has been fastest and where it's been slowest, and you can see a big driver of social progress has been the widespread adoption of information technology and better information provided to lots of places. We're actually seeing some backward movement on, I think it's on tolerance and on personal rights. Actually, personal rights globally are in decline, and that's pretty alarming. They've declined in 33 countries. No, hang on, I can't see the exact numbers here. A lot of countries on freedom of expression and political rights. They've declined on personal safety due to a rise in homicides and violence crimes. And we're seeing increases in a large number of countries in intolerance for immigrants, discrimination against minorities. The top performers this year were Denmark, Finland, Iceland, Norway, Switzerland. In terms of the G8 countries, Canada was the best performer. America came in 18th. And then at the bottom of the list, you've got, as I say, Central African Republic and Afghanistan. Interestingly, by focusing on non-financial measures, you're able to actually regress the SPI against GDP, and then you find that as GDP per capita rises, you do tend to find a rise in social progress, but there's massive variation between countries with very similar levels of per capita GDP and the social progress they're able to attain with that income and wealth, which I think opens up a huge debate. Why is a country like America, that has a very high per capita GDP, doing so much worse in terms of its social progress that it delivers for each unit of GDP? And that opens up, I think, this vast opportunity for research and debate around what works and what doesn't work. And we have actually taken each country in the index and measured it on all the metrics we're using against a peer group of countries with similar GDP per capita, and you start to see either green lights where they're outperforming or red lights where they're underperforming. And so America underperforms on personal safety and on environmental quality, among other things, probably does better on higher education and things of that kind. It's been adopted now. The EU is starting to use it in the Commission to try and evaluate its local support for underprivileged regions in the European Union and make sure it's getting its policy right there. You can see, again, a map with the different levels of social progress across the European Union. Paraguay has it in a national plan that they've set a social progress index target alongside GDP targets. That's survived a change of political party, and so that's a pretty good basis for hoping that it will continue to inform their policies in the medium term. Regarding the Sustainable Development Goals, we have assumed that if we've done an exercise whereby if you look at the current correlation between GDP per capita and each of the indicators of social progress that we use, and assume that that relationship continues into the future, and you add the long-term economic growth forecasts that exist, if you say that the sustainable goals are supposed to be achieved by 2030, we think you need to get to a score of 75 globally to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals, and we currently think we're on trend to get to about 67. So on current policies, unless there's a radical step change in the quality of how we turn GDP into social progress, we're not going to get anywhere near the Sustainable Development Goals by 2030. So there is here a very strong message that we have to learn from what's working and to really work hard to raise our game. So we have also started to work to go beyond countries, to go down to the city and state level. And we've done an exercise with partners in Colombia where we've taken the 10 biggest cities in Colombia and measured SPIs for each of those. and we've tracked them over time, and you can see how different cities, like a city like Medellin, which was famous once as the drugs capital of the world, is now one of the best performing social progress cities in the world. And we've again done a similar dashboard effect of traffic lights of which cities are outperforming and on which metrics they're doing that. We're even starting to produce maps that can show how a different city. Here we've taken Bogota and gone down to each electoral district within the city, created an SPI for each of those, and you can see how on the three main pillars you get a map of the city showing where the real challenging areas are, where the stronger areas are. And again, we can actually show progress over time. So if you look at that middle left side of the map, there's a big red blob around 2009. That was the poorest electoral district in Bogota, where there's been massive investment in sanitation and infrastructure over the last 5 or 6 years, and you can see that is reflected in an improvement in their social progress index score. We think there's enormous opportunity to do this more local approach around the world, and we're hoping very soon to work on an SPI for all the states of the United States, so all 50 states, and we're looking for partners to get involved in that project, as well as identifying cities where we think there's opportunities to do interesting work in this area. Just to end, there are 3 areas we're really prioritizing. One is a lot of the data that we're using, in order to be comparable across so many areas, the data we're using is not as good as we'd like it to be, because it's official data, and lots of countries measure different things slightly differently. So we're constantly looking to improve data and to work with experts in each of the areas that we're looking at. I know, coming out of the conversation we've had about pollution here, that we're probably more focused on the older definition of pollution and less on modern pollution than we need to be, so I want to work to make sure we get that data improved. But it looks like all this new information technology data that's out there, the big data phenomena, we must be able to get beyond the official statistics that take ages to come out and move towards something that's much more informed by real-time data. And so we're looking to work with anyone that's interested in that question of how do you take what the mobile phone companies, what Google, what Facebook have, and turn that into useful social data. We're looking to create tools for companies to figure out how they're doing on CSR or their core citizenship agenda, and we're working with a number of impact investors because we believe actually that this SPI data will be a good leading indicator of things from sovereign risk to actually be a framework where impact investors can see how much difference they're making if we can create the right tools to help turn this aggregate data into something that's really more helpful to be embedded in investment programs. And we're looking to form as many new partnerships as we can. This is a small non-profit with some important supporters, but we really want this to be something that is based on people who want to use this framework and data to actually develop a better understanding of their own communities and how they can be most impactful in improving them and strengthening them and providing the resilience that's talked about. So I'm going to be around all day. I'm very keen to talk to people, very happy to share all the data in this presentation and talk further. But I do think that the thing in the 20th century, economic policy improved dramatically because of all the work that took place over a 30-year period, much of which initially was very poor work. The debate about implementation of GDP and profit data led to pretty good accounting and at a national level and local level and business level in the financial markets. I think the 21st century we moved to a model where impact is embedded, social progress is embedded in what we're trying to measure and do as a society, and we're at the start of this important process of creating the data that allows us to know we're doing a good job and to set targets that are really going to deliver a better society to people. And I really just want to invite you all to be part of that conversation with us and help us to get in 30 years' time the kind of progress to really meaningful impact data, social progress data that allows us all to know we're doing meaningful work and putting the right things first. So thank you very much.